What in? Logic's back with another one. Today, we're going to look at Stephen A. Smith has gotten Ben Shapiro on his show, and he wants to talk to him about his recent campaign of pardoning Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd back in 2020. I'm covering this because two interesting personalities I get to see go at it in a debate, and because, you know, I recently have made a little commentary video on the Daily Wire. If you haven't watched it, make sure you check it out. I'm gonna put it in the description and at the end of this video. You can watch this now and then go back and see how I ended up talking about it, or you can stop this video, watch that Daily Wire video, and then return back to this video. But Ben Shapiro is campaigning that Derek Chauvin should be pardoned. Stephen A. Smith took issue with this, so he invited him on his show, and they're going to hash it out. Before we get into it, make sure to leave a like, comment, sub, if not one, then all three. Now, let's get to the video.
So we're going to get right into that. Please welcome to the show the one and only Mr. Ben Shapiro. Ben, how are you, sir? How's everything?
Thank God, doing well, Stephen. How are you doing?
Okay, I want to ask, and I asked this affectionately. I'm not trying to be incendiary. You called me a jackass. How many dudes do you call a jackass and then you go on this show? Could you tell me that? Could you answer that one first?
Hey, I appreciate you having me on, and the invitation, as you know, is open the other way around. It's shockingly, the answer is probably a lot, actually, in terms of the number of people who I've called a jackass who I've then actually become friendly with, or who I've had on the show, or vice versa. So, you know, you're in this business, you know it.
I got you. I'm not overly offended. Trust me on that. All right. But thank you for coming on the show. So let's get right into it. As you know, I spoke out against your petition to get President Trump to pardon former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. For those that don't know, Chauvin was sentenced to 22 years in prison after being convicted of unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter of George Floyd. I wondered if you would feel that way if the officer was black and the victim was Jewish. That was what I said. And your response was to call me a race baiter. Why is that, Ben Shapiro?
Well, to me, the entire case against Derek Chauvin was rooted in a sort of public racial essentialism that I thought was unnecessary to analyze the case.
No, the fuck it wasn't. It wasn't part of the court case at all. It wasn't nothing he was being accused of legally. It wasn't any, to my understanding, it wasn't in any of the evidence to get him convicted. None of that. So you're going off of what the public and the social part of what this case was about. Legally, the race had nothing to do with why he was convicted. The evidence pointed to why he was convicted, and it had nothing to do with being black. If you want to talk about if this is all about race, that's a separate conversation as to what really happened.
If I'm going to look at this case and just look at the facts of the case, the race of the person on the ground and the race of the officer are irrelevant, and we should treat it exactly the same, whether both people were black, both people are white, one person was Jewish.
You're right, and if everything was the same and either one of their races or both were swapped to any other race, the outcome should have still been what it was if other factors remain the same.
One person was not Jewish. The identity of the person on the ground, I think, should not be the deciding factor in whether or not Derek Chauvin was convicted of second-degree murder. It should be the situation, the facts of the case, the autopsy report, and all of the rest. And so the thing that I actually objected to was the suggestion that my opinion would have changed, rooted in the, say, racial or religious identity of the person who died, as opposed to.
It would have, because you wouldn't care this much. You wouldn't care if they. This is irrelevant to the case itself. But you would not go hard about getting somebody pardoned if both of them was white, if both of them was black, if the person that got killed was white and the officer was black. You would not be campaigning on pardoning that person. You wouldn't. Because the circumstance was fucked regardless of the races. That's how bad this situation was. Some situations, you know what I'm saying, it's clear cut that it's racial, and then there's some where it's like, this is fucked no matter whose race it was. But it's also an argument to be made that it's hard to imagine that this type of situation would happen if that was a white man on the ground.
Racial or religious identity of the person who was the police officer. I just don't think that that's how we ought to decide criminal justice cases in general.
In fairness to you, I can understand that in general. Damn it, in most instances, I can agree with that. But those are cases that we hear about. I'm talking about the visual impact. So let's stay right there, Ben. I am a black man, and I see this black man on the ground, face down, hand.
Stephen A. is finna blow me because he keeps talking about his race, and all of that does is add fuel to Ben's argument. And this case, You can talk about all of the take race out of it completely. All of the facts of the situation makes it that Derek Chauvin should have gotten the conviction he did. Period. Like, he was guilty of everything that they charged him with. The manslaughter, second degree, third degree, all that shit. He was guilty of it because of his actions. Fuck the races. And Steven's finna give him optical wins by harping on the race part when it had nothing to do with the conviction.
Handcuffs behind him. Face is imprinted into the pavement.
All that is what matters.
The knee
not the
of
race.
the police officer is on the back of his neck. He's literally saying he can't breathe, to one point crying for his mama. And it happens for over 9 minutes. I understand from a technical perspective, from a specific analytical perspective, forensic evidence, et cetera, fentanyl in the system, et cetera. I got all of that. My point is, and my question to you at that time was, seeing that, how could you have another opinion? How could it be based on the preponderance of evidence that you threw into the fray in order to ask for this man to be pardoned? I'm just going by, like...
You see what I'm saying? All that, like you said, seeing it, all of that is irrelevant to the race. Seeing what we saw, the race is irrelevant.
There are certain things that you just see, and 1 + 1 = 2.
So, I mean, Stephen, actually, if you go back to my tweets at the time, May 30th and June 1st, if you look at my tweets, I'm saying the same kind of things you're saying right now.
Now, to be fair, you can see some things, and with further information, your perspective can and should change if the evidence is contrary to what you saw. This ain't one of them situations.
I'm saying the same kind of things at that time that everybody else is saying, seeing the tape, because there's no way to look at the tape.
I saw that.
And not be sort of shocked by what you're seeing on the tape, obviously. And then I think that the mark of a reasonable person is to change your opinion as the evidence changes. A lot of evidence emerged between the time that the tape was released, that horrible 9-minute tape, and the time the conviction actually happened. I mean, there's a full trial, there were autopsy reports, there was witness evidence, there were other people whose testimony was taken, there were multiple medical specialists who were called. And so in looking at all of that, that's the way we're supposed to adjudicate whether or not a person deserves to spend 22 years in prison, not based simply on our immediate gut response to the tape. And again, I had the same gut response to the tape that you did, and I think that everybody did. I think actually that tends to be the gut response of people when we see a lot of police activity, actually. It turns out that the police do a lot of things that look really rough on tape and really difficult on tape, and this was one of those things. And then as we later learned that, for example, the sort of tactic that Chauvin is using there was actually trained by the Minneapolis Police Department, right? No,
it wasn't. What was trained was a restraint on their back. Was it their shoulder or their chest or something like that? They're not trained to put their knee on nobody's neck. So let's say I grant you that they're trained to use that maneuver on anybody that they have arrested. If you do it incorrectly, you're still liable for what happened. So say they train it, he does it wrong, he's guilty of it. He did it. Period. Like, that's what he did. You can be trained to do something. Don't you get CCL license? You get your concealed carry license. If you perform something, you did all the training. You got it. Your gun is legal. You know what I'm saying? You ain't got one in the chamber. Everything you do right. The moment you do something wrong with what you've been taught, you're liable. And it's even worse because you were taught it. So you can carry legally and all that shit, but the moment you do something you're not supposed to do, as knowing what you are supposed to, you're guilty of it. And the worst part is they don't train you to put your knee on their neck. They're supposed to put it on their shoulder. And if you this ain't Loki's wager. There's a distinct difference between your neck and your shoulder. There's no way you can get those two body parts confused.
It's a submission technique that's used if you have a person who's resisting arrest, or if you learn during the course of the investigation that George Floyd was saying, "I can't breathe," before he was even taken out of the car. He says, "I can't breathe" on the longer tape 6 times before he's even taken out of the car. I mean,
so the fuck what? He didn't want to go to jail. We've all know how people are when they finna get arrested. They come up with all these excuses and all this shit when they're in trouble. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I'll never do it again. I can't breathe. I need to go to the hospital. Whatever. My mama's calling me. My foot hurts. I can't walk. People do all that shit when they don't want to get arrested. That's all that was. Why are you saying he said I can't breathe before that? How much time had elapsed between him saying he couldn't breathe in the car to the point where he was on the floor with a knee on his neck for 9 minutes?
It's a very long interaction with the police officer.
Yeah, that doesn't help your argument. The interaction was long. It was extremely long for those that watched all of it. It was long. But you know what? Did he ever have shown any signs of dying until a knee was on his neck for 9 minutes, Ben? Was it? Seems like all this long interaction, I didn't see any signs of him on the verge of death. He wasn't falling. His eyes weren't glazing over. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't foaming at the mouth. Nothing was happening until a knee was on his neck for 9 minutes. And he was really saying, he really couldn't breathe.
Before you get to that 9-minute tape, the part that we all saw, and there's a part of the story that you can't see on the tape, which is the reverse angle. You can't see that there's a big crowd that's shouting at Chauvin. Chauvin is responding to that crowd. One of the preliminaries to getting up off of Floyd that way is to call what's called a code 4, which is where it's an all clear, where you feel that the crowd is not a threat to you. In fact, even the EMTs who showed up to provide care for Floyd didn't call a code 4 when they arrived on scene because they thought that the crowd was too threatening. So once you take into account all of the facts, if your opinion doesn't change and the fact pattern is different from what you originally thought it was, then you're not doing your job as a commentator. So I can have the same gut response that you have when I first see that tape. The question is what you do when more of those facts emerge, when you do see more of that evidence emerge, when you do read the testimony and see the autopsies.
See, but I believe, and this is just my belief, because in fairness to you, you're absolutely right. You did put out that tweet initially, and your position was it was shared by the Hannitys of the world, the Mark Levins of the world, and various others, obviously with a lot of people on the left as well, before the preponderance of evidence that you're alluding to came into play. I get that. So in fairness to you, I have to say that. But sometimes I'm going to say this to you because you're a pretty brilliant dude. Nobody can deny it with what you've accomplished with the Daily Wire, what you've been able to do in your career. I'm just reading something. You were a syndicated columnist at the age of 17 for crying out loud. This is who you are. This is who I'm talking to here. Is it possible that sometimes we could be so brilliant that our intellect gets in the way of common sense? For example, what I mean.
So I'll take that back. That was a good way to get into that point. I'll take that back.
By that is this, Ben. It was a knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes. If that didn't happen, is he still alive? I'm not talking about today.
Yep. Is he alive if there was, be honest, Ben. If that knee wasn't on his neck, would he have not lived that day? Do you really think that if that didn't happen, he still would have died? He had that long interaction with the police officer before the knee was on his neck, didn't really show no signs of on the verge of death. So do you think he would die if that knee wasn't on his neck? Be honest.
Anything could have happened to you that day. I'm just saying the fact that Derek Chauvin's knee was on his neck, that to me should speak for itself, because if the man is clamoring for you to get off the back of his neck while you got him handcuffed into the ground, okay, why is it wrong for us to stop there and say that was excessive on the part of the police officer because you had him contained? He wasn't a threat to you. What's wrong with that thinking?
Okay, so there are a couple of things that could be argued by the defense, and in fact were argued by the defense in this case. One of them, again, was that this was a trained technique by the Minneapolis Police Department.
Again, if he executed it wrong, it doesn't matter if it was trained to him, and they didn't train you to put your knee on anybody's neck.
To keep somebody in this position, so long as you have not called a code 4, which is where you say there's an all clear, and now you can move the person who's on the ground into the ambulance, for example, if you've already called the ambulance, or back into the police vehicle. When it comes to the actual question as to causation of death, right? You have to be the proximate cause of the death.
It's cause of death. That's what we're talking about.
Just enough for it to be a contributing factor, because it turns out that increased stress can cause death in a person who has a human heart that is significantly larger than normal. The autopsy showed that Floyd...
It doesn't matter. The police officer did it. I don't care if his heart was... Y'all saw my video. I hope you did. But... I don't care how big his heart was. I don't care if he had blood clots. I don't care if he had COVID. I don't care if he had fentanyl in his system. He had meth in there too, I believe. It doesn't matter. The knee on the neck is what cause of death. All those other factors played the part. The cause was the knee. Now, the knee wasn't the playing part, but the drugs is what killed him. No. I know Ben has said that in another video. He said it before. If he was, it was in the autopsy, or no, it was since I forgot what report it was in. But if they had found him at home like that, it would be an overdose. Yeah, but if he was at home dead, it wouldn't have been an overdose. It wouldn't have been because a knee was on his neck. It would have been because of an overdose. But that's not what happened. So I don't care about all that shit. The other factors didn't help the situation. Maybe if he didn't have meth in his system, maybe if he didn't have fentanyl in his system, maybe if he didn't have an enlarged heart, he wouldn't have died. Maybe. But he was in that's what he had, and the officer knee on his neck killed him. That's one of the things that come with being a police officer. If it's those factors that you don't know about, you need to be careful because you can't just kill people and be like, oh, I ain't know his heart was big. My bad. Like, no, it don't work like that.
Unfortunately, had an incredibly enlarged heart, much heavier than normal. His lungs were much larger than normal person's lungs because of heavy and over time drug use. He had 11.
And don't you think all those are the contributing factors, but the one that the cause was the knee on the neck, Ben, obviously?
Nanograms of fentanyl in his system at the time per milliliter of blood, which is over 3 times what it would cause normally to kill somebody. The original autopsy report.
Not somebody that fucking built up, not immunity, but a tolerance to drugs. We know that drug users build a higher tolerance. Why are you comparing? If he was, y'all all agree that he was an avid drug user. So you're going to ignore that he built a tolerance? Why are you talking about what a normal person can handle when obviously a person has never done it before, can't handle that same amount because they didn't build a tolerance? That defeats your argument of him saying he's a drug user. If he was a drug user, a long time habitual drug user, obviously his tolerance is higher, so comparing his tolerance to a normal person is a moot point.
Or openly said that if George Floyd had been found in his house in the same exact physical condition, they would have called it death by overdose. So, all of these things taken into account raises the question of reasonable doubt, right? The standard in our criminal justice system is in fact a reasonable doubt standard. And that raises the question as to why there's not
a reasonable fucking doubt. Because none of these doubts, this isn't reasonable. What you're saying isn't reasonable. That's the point. You're saying the contributing factors are the causes when it's the inverse.
Very least reasonable doubt. So you can say that your sort of first jump at this is he's guilty. Look at the knee on his neck. There's no damage to his neck tissue, by the way.
So what? You don't have to have damage to your neck tissue to not breathe. What are you saying? You need your throat and lungs to work in tandem to breathe. Just because there's no damage to it doesn't mean it wasn't restricted long enough for him to not breathe.
In the autopsy report, you can say all of that, and you can say that that's a plausible explanation. I won't even.
Agree that the enlarged heart, the drugs, all that stuff made the situation worse. I agree, but that's not the cause of death. That's the difference of what we're talking about. The cause was the knee on the neck restricting his airway, despite how big his heart was, despite how his lungs worked, despite the drugs in his system. The knee on the neck is the reason he died. The other shit didn't help the situation. It made it worse.
That's not a plausible explanation. I'll make the case that a plausible explanation is not enough to convict a man in court, especially based on the surrounding circumstances, the amount of pressure that was brought. This was not a fair trial is one of the points that I'm making. So when it comes to the actual trial itself, there are members of the jury who are at actual rallies wearing shirts that said, "I can't breathe," before they were actually on the jury. There are members of the jury who have openly.
Well, both sides picked him. The prosecution should have chose better than. First of all, I don't even know if I believe that. I don't know one way or another. Don't know how I could find it out. But I don't believe Ben with even saying that. I don't believe him because he's lying about this case in itself. So he's going to keep saying things to add on to his story. But both sides had to agree to the jurors, and that's just what it is. So what you say don't fucking matter at this point.
Said that they felt public pressure to convict in a particular way. The president of the United States, or one of the people who was running for president of the United States at the time, Joe Biden, was openly calling for his conviction. The Minneapolis city paid the family of George Floyd, I believe it was a $27 million payout in the middle of the trial. So all of this tends to go to, is that an impartial jury, right? These all have serious consequences for the jury system. And so there's really a few separate questions. One is, was Chauvin responsible for Floyd's death? I think on that question, I would say no. You can say yes. I would say at the very least there's reasonable doubt. And then there's the question of
it's not reasonable doubt. It's not reasonable whatsoever.
The amount of pressure that was brought on the jury in this particular case to bring a verdict. This was the most highly publicized trial of the modern era by a long shot because the incident itself had spurred so much public angst and outrage and massive protests involving 20 million people and riots that had cost the taxpayers some $2 billion or insurance companies some $2 billion. It was the most highly publicized trial probably since the OJ trial. And because of that amount of public pressure, did Chauvin receive a fair trial is obviously a very crucial question here.
I don't know. Since Trayvon, to me, honestly, Martin's story was pretty fucking big. You forgot about that one. And now what about the public outcry and what the public said about that? I said that too in my other video. What about all the public pressure of society and the blah, blah, blah? Fucking Zimmerman got off, and most people don't agree with that. So spare me with the whole public outcry shit.
But it sounds like your position is that this is more of a political issue as opposed to a policing issue.
Yep.
And what I would say to you as a black man in America, that
Stop
there are
saying
times—
black man. It doesn't matter, Steven. Stop. You're giving him credit. You're giving him more stuff to go off of, but keep mentioning your race. Stop. If that's a separate conversation, how about you get the legal shit and the police shit out the way? Then if you want to talk about race, do it. But stop making your argument based on race, because it looks bad. Fuck.
And there's a preponderance of evidence throughout the years that shows that policing has been an issue as it pertained to black men, which is one of the things
that's not what he was convicted of. None of his conviction had to do with their races. Fucking Christ.
Constantly bring up. So when that incident happened, I'm thinking about the officer himself, Ben Shapiro, and his intent from the standpoint, you're having your knee on the back of his neck. No matter what, from a medical perspective, we can deduce may have transpired. In the end, if you didn't have your knee on the back of his neck for that amount of time or exceeding 9 minutes, this would not have been the outcome.
Yeah.
And because you were insensitive to that, as a trained police officer who should know better, there should be a level of culpability that comes in your direction. So when somebody looks at you,
because with what Ben's saying, he's saying, well, they're trained to do that. So therefore, Ben's saying that officers can now, since they were trained to do that, and he wasn't guilty of killing him, they can go around putting their knee on men's neck, and if they die, it doesn't matter because the police was trained to do that. That's basically what he's saying. So if anybody else dies because they got their knee on the neck because they're trained to do it, then that's just a result of what happens. That just gives you an out to just go out there and kill people by putting your knee on their neck and say, well, we trained to do this. The fuck out of here.
I look at, and this is where I wanted to go as well. I'm looking at a Ben Shapiro, and this is what I meant when I asked the question about you being, about if George Floyd was a Jewish person. I owe you an explanation for that. So I want to give it to you right now. You are known as a proud Jewish individual, incredibly supportive of the Jewish community, being amongst them, Israel, other things. And I was bringing this up because I said, if that were a Jewish person, the conclusion that you ultimately reached, would you have been patient enough to draw that conclusion, peeling from—
He's making an emotional argument, and it's like, He's making it sound like this shit. Sorry, scared the fuck out of me. I hit my button on accident. But no, he's making it sound like your emotion to this is all that should carry throughout the conviction, and it's not. The facts of the case is enough to carry out the conviction, so you don't have to bring race into this. The merits of the case and everything surrounding it is more than enough information you need to understand that Derek Chauvin killed him. Like, this shit is pissing me off.
The information that was deduced on an objective level to reach the conclusion that, hey, you know what? I don't think he should have been put in jail. That's where I was going, because I know how defensive, or I shouldn't say defensive, but a defender of the Jewish community that you are. And that's what I was thinking along those lines.
I mean, but I certainly hope so, because I can name you a dozen Jewish criminals who absolutely deserve to be in jail.
We're not talking about Jewish criminals, you fuckhead. He's talking about a police officer carrying out their duties irresponsibly. This is a criminal should be in jail, and Derek Chauvin is a criminal now. So, but the fact is, you're not looking at it. You're not looking at it objectively. You almost are saying because their races are opposite, therefore Derek probably didn't do it. Like, that's the vibe I'm getting. Since there's a black and a white man involved, then racial tensions was too high for this case to be carried out fairly, even though the fucking autopsy said he died because he couldn't breathe because there was a knee on his neck. You're ignoring that because of the race while you're trying to claim that Stephen A is the race baiter. Because like he's saying, if that man was Jewish, you wouldn't be doing all this analytical, who was he, how much drugs was in his system, and well, he has a history, his heart was big. You wouldn't give a fuck about none of that. You probably wouldn't. I agree with Stephen when he says that, but he's harping on it, and the evidence of the case is more than enough to make the argument.
Right, and Jeffrey Epstein was a Jew.
No, I'm just talking about that kind of.
Obviously, Epstein should be in jail, but he's comparing Jeffrey Epstein to a police officer that at the time we didn't know if he was going to be committed with a crime, but you're ignoring the facts of it to cherry pick what fits your narrative. You're ignoring everything that goes against what you say to fit your narrative.
Hell, right? I mean, I think that
I'm just talking about that kind of incident.
And my point is that whenever, I'm also a lawyer, right? I mean, my identity as a Jew does not mean I have solidarity with a criminal who happens to be a Jew, or a person who's in a controversial law enforcement confrontation who happens to be a Jew. I mean, my job is to literally remove myself from and I think also that, as those original tweets show, I don't think that you have to have racial solidarity with a person in order to feel empathy for that person's situation. I think that the whole basis of a democratic republic, or us having a conversation right now, is the fact that we can speak to each other across racial and identitarian lines. Right. And so, again, I think that there are an enormous number of people in the country who disagree with me, by the way, who share both my race, and a lot of Jews who, I would say the vast majority of Jews disagree with me on this, or many white Americans who looked at George Floyd and had exactly the same reaction. And as you say, initially, I had the same reaction as you, and that had nothing to do with race. And so the kind of idea that let's put it this way, if race is a barrier to logic, then race is the problem, not the solution. Right? Let me ask you this.
Fuck out of here. You're using race to defy logic. Honestly, don't say race is a barrier to logic. You're using race to go against logic at this point, because the logic, all of this, despite if I told you the facts of this case without leaving out anything, the conclusion isn't, well, he died from an overdose. Like, that's why I say he's like a reasonable. It's not reasonable to think he died from an overdose if you go over everything. It's not reasonable at all.
I mean, if you looked at, you said before that you didn't look at the autopsy report, you're not taking a lot of time looking at the evidence or the autopsy. What would it take for you to change your mind on the case? Or is there nothing that could change your mind on the case because you saw the tape, for example?
Well, it wouldn't take much, and this is why I said this, because normally I would look at the autopsy reports or whatever. I saw people bringing it up as arrest record.
So is he saying he didn't look at the autopsy? Why are you arguing this shit and you don't know everything? Not everything, but you know what I'm saying? At the very least, you should have looked at the autopsy report, because what if the autopsy report says he died from an overdose and you're arguing that he didn't? Now I feel like Stephen A is just talking out his ass, because you just basically said you didn't look at the autopsy. What if the autopsy said it was a fucking overdose and that's why he's arguing this? Would you be arguing still? No, I think it's the knee on his neck, because that's what Ben's doing right now. Ben is saying it was an overdose, even though the autopsy said it was because he couldn't breathe because his neck was being compressed.
People bringing up fentanyl in the system. I saw all of these things. And all I could come to, Ben, fair or unfair, was that none of that matters if he wasn't on the ground with a knee on the back of his neck for 9+ minutes.
But because that's what I'm saying. That's, like I said, the information agrees with Stephen, but you're saying that without actually looking at it, which I don't like. I don't like when you're right for the wrong reasons. Like, you can't be right without knowing the information and claim to be knowing the information. That's some bullshit. Now, Ben is more sinister because he looked at the autopsy and it says he died because of the restriction of his neck, and doesn't give a fuck and is just saying it's a drug overdose. So both of them niggas is pissing me off right now. Everybody's stupid.
Looking at a trained police officer who should know better. I looked at the experts who were saying, with their trade, there was no reason, and you saw it, I'm sure you saw this, and not to say that you would embrace it with the level of sincerity that others may, because I know the level of skepticism that you look at when you see the news outlets, and by the way, I don't blame you. I'm with you on that, okay? But I would say to you, listening to experts talk about how police officers are trained and pointing to the fact that Derek Chauvin had no business being in that position and putting George Floyd in that position, particularly once he was handcuffed and contained. To me, that, along with the ultimate outcome, is all the evidence I need. And that's where we might differ.
Right. I mean, that's totally fair if we
You see
differ
what
on.
I'm saying? That's all you need, nigga. The very bare minimum is to see what the autopsy report said the cause of death was, and you not doing that is insane. That's oh my god.
That. I guess the question I would ask you is, given the fact that that was a Minneapolis Police Department trained protocol, given the fact that Floyd did ask to be removed from the car. I mean, in the lead up to this situation, the part of the tape that nobody watches, he was actually outside the car. The police officers move him inside the car. He says he's claustrophobic, and then he claims 6 consecutive times that he cannot breathe while he's in the car. So if the idea is that it was the police officer's knee that deprived him of breath, he was already claiming that he couldn't breathe inside the car, suggesting he was already in the middle of some sort of medical event, right? And then he was brought outside the car. I guess the question that I have for you, again, is what level of evidence would need to be shown to for you to get to reasonable doubt? I mean, you seem incredibly certain, right? All I'm saying is that the reasonable doubt standard is what pertains in criminal justice. What would it take to get you to reasonable doubt? Or is there no reasonable doubt that could be achieved simply by dint of the fact that he had his knee on his neck? By the way, it's not for the full 9 minutes. There are minutes where it's on his back. I mean, even the prosecution acknowledges that. The real question is, I think, the last 50 seconds, right? The last 50 seconds of the tape where Floyd stops breathing and Chauvin's knee is still on his neck. That is really the question as to whether this goes into criminal charge territory. Otherwise, he ends up being in a position where he's actually just using a typical subdual technique before you put the guy back in the car and you take him off to jail.
And I'm saying, to answer your question, there's absolutely nothing that could convince me that Derek Chauvin deserved a different outcome because of what you just articulated, what we saw, even if it's for the last 50 seconds. I'm not changing my position. I understand where you're coming from.
I mean, this is a real question. Do you think so? We've talked about race a little bit. Do you think that Chauvin was a racist? This was a race-based crime, in your view?
Do I believe that?
Yes.
See,
I don't believe.
Do you see this narrative Ben is trying to spin, making it, is this a race-based crime? He wasn't convicted on no race-based crime, nor is that what we're talking about. You're harping on the race when the merits of the case itself shows that Derek Chauvin killed him. The race isn't why he's in jail right now. That's a separate conversation to have.
That based on any.
And it doesn't matter what Stephen A. thinks about that either. The facts of the case very strongly points to Derek Chauvin being the cause of the reason he died.
Thing about his history that they articulated, because I know how people conjure up evidence to go at it. I do believe his actions indicated that, because I didn't see him doing that with anybody else. And the times that we were living in and the climate, as you articulated accurately, I might add, the heightened level of sensitivity that it exists because of brutality on the part of some police officers. By the way, I never say police brutality because I don't like to castigate all police officers that way. I know if I'm in trouble, I'm calling 911. I'm not going to sit up there and denigrate police officers throughout this country. But there's rogues that exist in every profession. And I think there's rogues that exist with certain police officers. So to me, he came across as one. And that was my problem with it. Having said that, I want to get to something else because we're going to stay on this subject of race in this regard. When you saw the climate that exists, I understand you believe it was primarily instigated by the left. I want to know where you draw the line in the sand, and in terms of veering away from the political and just looking at a case on its merit and saying, this is what I see. This is where I stand.
It seems like Steven's not listening because Ben thinks that he's talking about the merit, funny enough. I feel like Steven's just not listening to what Ben, I mean, he's listening, but it seems like he's not like internalizing it, and it seems like Steven just wants to make talking points and have Ben respond. He seems like he has questions he just wants Ben to answer without really having the conversation in real time, probably because he doesn't know all the facts of it, which is fucking frustrating because Ben thinks that he's talking about the merits of the case right now when in actuality, he's not. He's talking about what he thinks and feels about this case, point blank, period. And then Stephen A. is talking about how he thinks and feels about the case, but just so happen to be right, which is not okay.
Completely devoid of politics. I'm not talking race, I'm talking politics, meaning this has nothing to do with politics. This is the climate that we're living in. This officer should have known better, etc. Do you ever find yourself in a position where you're able to dismiss yourself from the political impact of something? or the political agenda of something to draw your conclusions.
Well, I mean, honestly, I think that in this particular case, this is a good indicator of trying to withdraw from a political sort of calculation, given the fact that, as some people have pointed out, on a pragmatic level, they suggested that President Trump pardoning Derek Chauvin would be bad for President Trump politically. And the case that I've made is that's his job, determine what's pragmatic for him politically. It's my job to call something out as wrong when I see it to be wrong. In terms of criminal justice cases that have involved race, where I've removed myself on the other side, I mean, there are a bunch of them. Walter Scott, right, is a great example of a black man who was victimized by a white police officer. The police officer ends up convicted.
And that too, because now he could just be like, look, I agree with all these other obvious cases of police brutality. I agree with these, so therefore I'm not making this about race. Now he can say all that shit. If you don't address race, all of this fluff and bullshit don't have to get talked about. I don't care if you agree with the obvious. Well, even though this one is pretty obvious, but it seems more sinister for some reason. I don't know why they're doing it, but the facts don't agree with you, Ben. So now he gets to talk about this bullshit that makes him seem more reasonable in this, because it's like, oh yeah, Walter Scott, that was obvious. You know, that was obviously a bad case. So and now I don't want to give him any room to do that type of shit. And Stephen A. don't have the fucking facts, and he's just gonna let him talk about race, and this ain't about race.
And going to jail. You're saying I'm not.
Well, I'm sorry. The race is important, because I do believe that he wouldn't have done that if it was a white man. But that's not why that's not the reason he got found guilty on all these charges. That's not the reason. So have that conversation aside from this one.
Campaigning on his behalf because he deserved to go to jail, the officer in the Walter Scott case. There have been a number of horrifying or police-involved crimes in which the police officer deserves to lose his job and or go to jail, depending on the activities of the police officer. And you have to analyze those one by one. And I think that what we've seen, particularly from the legacy media over the course of the last many years, is that the only types of stories that tend to break into the news are ones with a black victim and a white police officer. And the media immediately jump to a particular narrative conclusion on the basis of that. And even if the facts end up debunking that conclusion, that narrative continues to be maintained. I mean, a good example of this might be Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, where the initial claim was that Michael Brown was shot in the back by a police officer in cold blood. And it turned out that every aspect of that story was false.
And now he gets to talk about all this other shit where, you know, I agree with this black person that got killed, but this one, I don't agree with this black person that got killed, but this is really where it was fake. And like all this conversation is irrelevant to fucking George Floyd's case. And for him to talk about they need to be separate, you're bringing up all these other ones. Well, to be fair, that is the separation. But all that shit is irrelevant. We talking about George Floyd, bro. And that's why Stephen A. don't need to talk about race, because now he's talking about all this other bullshit.
False, and yet there are still people who will, you know, sort of repeat the hands up, don't shoot lie that never happened. I mean, that literally never happened, and that was debunked by the Eric Holder Department of Justice, for example. So, you know, I think that we really do have to look at each one of these situations in isolation. We're talking about the life of a person. If you're talking about narrative, if you're talking about sort of generalized race in America, then I think that it's important to look at as much data as humanly possible. I'm a data-driven person, and so I'll look at everything from the studies of Roland Fryer over at Harvard University about police misconduct toward minorities, and it ranges on the scale, by the way. What Roland Fryer studies tend to show is that, for example, there's no disproportionate killing of black men by the police. There's disproportionate use of lower level uses of forces by police depending on the circumstance based on race. So that's something Roland Fryer has found at Harvard. Right? Like that's the sort of conversation that I think is useful and interesting. But I think that when it gets telescoped into one particular case, and then that case is used as sort of the meta narrative justifier, that's really negative, and that's really bad for the country. Because what we should be doing, you want to lose trust in the criminal justice system overall, telegraph all race relations into the OJ case, the Michael Brown case, the Derek Chauvin case, the George Floyd case. If you take all of America's race relations and you sort of put it on the back of one particular fact pattern, usually the fact pattern is not capable of carrying that narrative burden.
But Ben, isn't that easy for us on the outside, looking at data, looking at analytics to draw those conclusions, as opposed to us having a personal experience or a personal investment in it? Like, for example, when it comes to the Jewish community, I would never think for 1 second that I could fully grasp and inhale what you experience as a Jewish person in the United States of America.
Matter in this situation,
heightened levels of anti-Semitism, for example, and people alluding to those kind of things. Well, I'm not a Jewish person, so I wouldn't know. What about the argument that when we talk about black folks, you can point to data all you want to, and we get that part, but the real experiences that we endure from time to time is not something that you can necessarily calculate. How serious do you take?
This is the problem. I do believe that race played a role in this situation, but when you're talking to somebody like Ben and the way he's approaching it, you don't want to give him that ground at all. If I had this conversation with just somebody on the street that disagreed with me, and we both had differing opinions on this, and they just like an average person, I would have race in that conversation. With Ben Shapiro and the way he's approaching it, his arguments, to say that race is the reason he got convicted, no. I'm not bringing up no race. I'm not letting him get that ground whatsoever. I'm talking about the merits of the case because that's what'll carry you through this conversation. But somebody that's on the street saying like, I don't know, he had drugs in his system, and if they don't have an argument based on, I think the public outcry is why he was convicted, and they just was harping on the drug part, then I could bring up the race stuff because they're not using it as an argument. And it further helps your argument. But for Ben, you don't need that because it's giving him too much ground.
Those assertions coming from a community, whether it's your own mind or anybody else's.
Obviously, it's true that we can never fully get into one another's shoes, right? I mean, that's just the reality of the world, and that's true beyond race. That's just true for individuals. You, Stephen, or me as an individual, you can't live in my shoes. I can't live in shoes. We're different people. We live different lives. Yeah, but when it comes to making public policy, then the only sort of gauge that you can have really is the data, because anecdotal evidence, you can't make public policy for millions of people based on anecdotal evidence, because you can't legislate people's feelings. I mean, this is sort of one of my things. You know, when it comes to trying to craft law, for example, making law based on the personal feelings of people's quote unquote lived experiences is a bad way to make law that is going to have to be generally applicable, because I may have particular feelings about a particular criminal case based on my own personal experiences. But if we do that, then what you end up with is a really high level of tribalism, in which it's if your racial identity prevails or my racial identity prevails, really bad things can come from that. And the law is designed to treat people as equal individuals underneath it. And so, you know, the relevance of lived experience, that may play a part in us being able to understand one another as individuals if we're having conversation over dinner, or if we're giving advice to each other about our kids. But when it comes to actually making public policy, it's a different thing.
Yeah, you got it. And you make a valid point about policy. When you talk about policy, you can't just go by personal experience. It's got to be the numbers. It's got to be the data. I totally get that. By the way, just as an aside, before I get to my next question, lung expert testified George Floyd died because his breathing was restricted. So I just wanted to point that out now, you know, because again, that's the weight on his neck.
What is your response, Ben? You're shaking your head. What is your response to that?
But let me go to this. I mean, the Trump pardon, which you obviously was advocating for, would only affect Chauvin's federal conviction where he pleaded guilty for violating Floyd's civil rights. The pardon would have no bearing on his state sentence for second-degree and third-degree murder. Even if Minnesota Governor Tim Walz pardoned him, he'd remain in prison regardless of Trump's actions. Of all the things to ask President Trump to pardon, then, why this, Ben? Why this?
So I've asked President Trump to do many, many things. This is certainly not the only thing that I'd like President Trump to do.
He said all the things to pardon. He didn't say things in general, did he?
Ranging from tariff policy to foreign policy to tax policy. There are many things that I asked President Trump to do on a daily basis on the show. On this one, because I think that it was such a driver of a narrative that I actually do think is false and has been damaging in the United States, which is the idea.
Why do you think it? It ain't the facts of the matter. It shouldn't be why you think it. So why do you think that, Ben?
Idea that there is a tremendous amount of racial tension in America, and that's accelerated over the past couple of decades. I think that it's important to elevate individual justice above, again, that sort of group identity-based narrative for the sake of the body politic.
What do you think pardoning George Floyd would do? You think that all the black people would be like, yeah, let's all come together. No more racial tension. No more bigotry. No more racism. Yeah, just let Chauvin out. I don't know if I said Floyd. I'm sorry. But let Chauvin out. Yeah, let's pardon him. It's okay. All is good. What the fuck do you think gonna happen if he got pardoned? And well, he still got the state that he can't get out of. So let's say there was a world where he got out of jail and could walk the streets. He probably don't even want that at this point. Zimmerman can do it, but this probably would be more egregious.
The BLM, movement of 2020 was at the very least incredibly divisive, and on a material level incredibly damaging.
And why was it divisive, Ben? Like, why? Do you think it's because black people just wanted to just go wreck shop and fuck shit up, like just for the fuck of it? Like, why are you acting like it was random that people was raising hell? And I'll say that COVID played a part in that too. I think people was just so on edge at that time. COVID was really, probably fucked a lot of people up mentally.
The United States. And I think that one of the things that I'd like to get back to in the United States is a time when we actually had pretty good racial feelings about one another, and it wasn't all that long ago. I think that if you go back to the
really?
Data, yes, if you go back
to between the black community and the Jewish community, sure, but the black community and white community?
So if you go back to Gallup polls of 2012, literally 2012, in 2012, 75% of white Americans thought that race relations were on a good path with black Americans, and 60
when Obama was president. The fuck? Yes. For everybody that wants to claim that Obama was just this horrible president, you know what I'm saying, that divided the country, you just cited 2012 as where race relations was good when Obama was president. Funny enough.
65% of black Americans also thought that race relations were on a good path in the United States. And then by 2014, it all dumped down into the below 50 mark for both white and black Americans, and it never recovered from there. And
when did the birtherism start? So in 2012, Trump was pushing the birther issue in 2012. 2013, he kept it alive. 2015, he launched his presidential campaign. So between 2012 and 2015, Trump was still talking about the birtherism stuff. Prior to it was going on since 2008. He released it in 2011. He said 2012 stuff was still good, but we probably didn't give a fuck in 2011 because we actually knew Obama was actually American, and then Trump pushed the issue before launching his campaign. So fuck you, Ben. Is it fair? Maybe I can't say that it was 100% Trump's fault, but the time kind of pushes on that a little bit. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's fair to think that maybe Trump's birtherism shit is what caused racial tension again, because the one black president that gets to be president gets questioned if he was actually American. Fuck out of here.
And one of the inciting events of that was, in fact, the rise in Ferguson and the sort of elevation of this narrative that America was deeply systemically racist in incurable ways, and that every inequality in American life could be chalked up to inequities that were buried in the founding of the country, and this whole broader racial narrative, which I think, again, that the best way to get past a lot of these problems, honestly, is to, it sounds naive, but it isn't. It's just reality. Any group problems, the best way to get past a group problem, if you're an individual, is to talk with another individual and to treat another individual as an individual, as opposed to trying to reduce everything to group identity, which is the reason I think I objected so strongly when you started talking about racial identity with regard to this case, because my whole point was, when it comes to interpersonal situations, the best way to treat other human beings, of course, is not as a member of a race. The best way to treat them is as individuals. And of course, a race is a component of their identity, but you treat them as an individual, regardless of what their race is.
Yeah, but my pushback with you would be, Ben, I came at what you said, not at you. You see what I'm saying? Because there's a lot of things that you say and do that I don't disagree with. You know, I'm a centrist, and there's some things, well, damn it, when you make sense, you make sense, okay? We're having this discussion right here. I'm listening to some of your points. I'm like, he's making sense on something. I mean, I get it. I might disagree, but I can't refute where you're coming from. It makes a lot of sense. And what I would ask you before we go, because I know you got to get on out of here, and I can't thank you enough for your time. And again, I'm going to come on your show when you ask me to as well. I really, really appreciate it. I'm not going to run from it. But I got to ask you this. When you talk about just treating individuals as individuals, one could easily argue that Ben Shapiro, with over 7.2 million followers, by the way, on his YouTube show. Okay, let's get that out the way with the Daily Wire and what you've been doing with that for years. Folks are not necessarily treated as individuals. There is groupthink. There are, and I'm not talking about just you. I'm talking about all of us. I'm talking about all of us. I'm guilty of it. You're guilty. Everybody, in my estimation. Where we think about something, when you had an issue with how I came at you, you brought up the left. And I'm disagreeing with the left at least 50% of the time, but you associated me with the left. When you've disagreed with others, I've heard you associate them with a group as opposed to treating them as individuals. So that seems to be counter to what you just articulated.
So I think that you're right to point out that I should characterize you as an individual with individual political views. Sure, I could do a better job of that. And when it comes to ideological grouping, I will say there is a difference between ideological grouping and, say, racial grouping. Right? Race is an immutable characteristic of who people are. No matter how many Kenny G tunes you listen to, Stephen, you'll still be a black man, and no matter and no matter what racial stereotype I engage in, I'll still be a nerdy Jewish guy. That's just the way it is. But when it comes to ideological groups,
he didn't know what rapper to name. He didn't want. I think he wanted to name a rapper, but he felt like he was going to be racist, or he didn't know one to name. Hilarious.
Are quite real, obviously, and so describing people as a member of an ideological camp, I don't think is targeting a group in the same way as it would be to target blacks as a group, or Jews as a group, or Asians as a group, or any other immutable characteristic.
Hey, Ben, we're running out of time. I know you've got to go. I've got to go. I would love to further this conversation with you into the future. Your show, my show, and it doesn't matter. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm thankful that you came on. My last question, am I still a jackass? I just want to make sure. Am I still a jackass? I just want to know.
No. Now you're the best, Stephen. That's how this works.
I got you. Ben Shapiro, man, I appreciate it, man. I'm looking forward to coming on your show, and I'm looking forward to having you back on so we can further this conversation, because obviously we're both running out of time. Thank you for the time, man. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Stephen A. just handled that conversation so poorly, in my opinion. I said it enough. I'm not going to keep repeating myself, but y'all know how I feel. With people like Ben, if that's what he was going to approach this conversation with, don't see no ground to race. Only talk about the facts and the merits of the case, because that was more than enough to make an argument for why Derek Chauvin was guilty of manslaughter and second and third degree murder, according to all the evidence. Fuck that other shit. Have that race conversation as an aside. But if you made it to this point in the video, make sure to leave a like, comment, sub. If not one, then all three. And I'm going to catch y'all in the next one. Peace.